Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovitt. Today we're on Lesson 46, Emotional Relearning, Part 1. You know, we just finished a whole series on reparenting and how God wants to take those things that we believe from childhood, those beliefs, those assumptions, those predictions, all those lies that we believe that are wrong, that cause us to react the way we do. He wants to help change those things. That's called maturity. In Romans, Paul wrote, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But it's more than just knowing. It has to be known here. It's emotional. The things that bother us were emotionally learned. And what we want to focus on now in the weeks to come, ending up this whole class, is how do we emotionally relearn. We want to transform our mind by emotionally relearning. And so today we're going to go a little bit on the theory of it. Next week we'll talk more about, what is learning? What is relearning again? Where we can just really understand this, and then we'll continue to go more into what is emotional relearning. And so I invite you to get the notes. If you don't have the notes, you need them, where you can read them and where you can really start to understand this. So you can contact me at ron@empowerministry.org. That's ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send you back the notes, okay? Well, my whole life really has prepared me to be at a stage like this, at a place like this, teaching this course. When I think about it, the first thing, there was 4 big influences in my life. The first was that I was an identical twin. And as an identical twin, my brother and I were very close. We were very identical, and we had what we called twin speak. We'd have our own language, right? We learned all these things about ourselves, through each other emotionally, right? We were able to pick up the nuances without even saying things, And so it created in me that ability to really have empathy, that ability to understand facial expressions, body language, and it made me sensitive. It made me very sensitive, and that sensitivity, I think, led to some of the issues that I had. The second part that led me to where I am today is that I had a lot of emotional issues. You might say I was even a phobic child. I had a lot of fears that I had to overcome. I had to focus on the ability to function even with my fears and how to overcome them. And I learned a lot about that. It was interesting. I took the first psychology course as a senior in high school. And I remember thinking about that, wow, I learned a lot of this when I was a child, I learned to overcome a lot of the things that were wrong with me through rethinking and through the different things that we teach here. The third thing that really, I think, made me who I am and made this whole program possible in my own life was Christianity. I became a follower of Jesus Christ when I was 11, and at 15 I decided I wanted to be a disciple. I wanted to follow him. I wanted to be in ministry, and so I did. I started ministry at 20 years old, and I started helping others, helping myself, and it was during that early phase of ministry that a lot of the emotional issues raised up inside me, but it forced me to study. It forced me to work on myself. It forced me to try to discover what's going on. And so I went back into education. I went back into psychology, clinical psych, and in undergrad and graduate work. And the fourth thing that influenced me was the decade of the brain. I had already finished my education, but in the 90s they had all the new scanning equipment. They were able to understand more about the brain, and I was at the right place at the right time, that I came across some articles that inspired me, and there was conferences going out at UCLA with some of the prominent people in this movement, Dan Siegel and Alan Shore and Vander Kolk and many others, and I was able early on to start studying under these people and learning a lot about this whole new, what they called affective psychology, and it really has made a huge difference. And out of that, 15 years ago, I started creating our own program. It started out in addictions, where we could help people with addictions, but soon I realized that a lot of us struggle emotionally because of what we believe. And so we started a program, and it ended up being the program that it is today. And part of that program is emotional relearning. Now, emotional relearning means that we have to relearn something that we emotionally learned. And I want to kind of go over that a little bit today, because as I studied and taught and wrote about emotional resilience, which this course is all about, it soon became apparent to me that we were really dealing in things that we learned emotionally. The standard approaches to emotional healing has been cognitive in nature. For many years it's been taught, and it's helped millions and millions of people, that what you think, what you perceive affects you, and so therefore you need to change what you're thinking. And the premise is true. It's accurate. But what I found out is that a lot of people are believing things emotionally, and it doesn't always work. And what happens is that you're getting triggered because of these false premises that you believe. It's much like I teach a lot of times, a person that feels that they're ugly and yet they're not. How do you convince them? That you can tell them that they're beautiful, and they can write it on a board 100 times and cognitively maybe try to understand it, but it's been emotionally learned. And they need to emotionally relearn that. And so a lot of those things, and so we went through the brain in the beginning of the class, and we had, remember the hand model of the brain? And so we had that, on the the top of our brain and the front of our brain, the cortex, right? That we had the prefrontal cortex up in here, especially the right prefrontal cortex, which is that executive center of our brain, the rational part of our brain. And then inside here we have the limbic area with the amygdala, which is that guard shack, which when signals come in, it tells us whether we should move, fight, flight, fright, and stuff like that, freeze, And so what happens is a lot of times an alarm comes in and we flip our lid, Dan Siegel says, right? This is his hand model. We flip our lid. There's no connection between the limbic area and the prefrontal cortex, the rational. And so we're living with the emotional reaction. And what we found is that if we can, do the things we taught in the class, right? We recognize it, and we regulate it. We buy that time to bring the prefrontal cortex back online, and we can start to think rationally, especially when we have the new things that we learn emotionally. We bring them back online. And so we taught, and we're teaching that, there's different degrees of emotional relearning. It depends upon how well ingrained the belief is, how emotional it really is, but a lot of times we can emotionally learn through 3 different ways. One is our body reaction, and we learn that basically when we're talking about emotional regulation. When we take something that alarms us and we relax and we can get through it, we ride the wave, we know that it's just a false alarm, we don't have to listen to it. Pretty soon we retrain that limbic area, that emotional area, that it isn't serious. We don't have to pay attention to it. And so we do that with panic attacks. We do that with OCD behavior. We do that with a lot of others. There's different therapies, exposure therapy, where they take a trauma and they have you remember it over and over until you're more calm and you react differently to it. Systematic desensitization is a real popular one for phobias, where you gradually, step by step, get closer to the phobia you don't like until actually the phobia doesn't scare you anymore. And so there's been a lot to do with the body reacting differently, and then it starts the brain to think and react differently, and you're not triggered. Another way is that what I call the cognitive shift. For some learning what the lie that they were believing and finding out what is true as a personal insight can change everything. This especially works when there's the question we ask ourselves, why? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And usually what we find is that when a person's overreacting to something, it's usually because they feel some kind of guilt, something wrong, that they were at fault somehow, even though it might not be true. And I know when I was taking cognitive processing therapy, they used a case where a young man was driving his car, and he was at the light. It was a stoplight. The light turned green, and even then he waited a second or so, and he approached, he went in, and a car came out of a parking lot or something, sped through and T-boned his car. Well, it was just the right kind of hit that it caused his sister, who was sitting in the other seat, to die. Well, he for years was punishing himself, thinking, there could have been something he could do. And under therapy, he was able to finally admit to himself that he had went down to turn the radio station. And that belief, that thing that was buried back in his mind, he felt if I hadn't done that, I could have avoided the accident. And when we found that out, they were able to, then suggest, well, what did the police say? What's the thing? And finally, he was able to see that no matter, that had nothing to do with it. There was nothing he could do to avoid that accident. And that brought him finally peace of mind. And so there was that cognitive shift. And the third thing is what I call the emotional aha. And that's really the crux of what we'll be teaching in here. And that's the one I feel is the most comprehensive and has the most lasting result. And that's getting back to, as close as possible, to maybe the initial time when we had that reaction to whatever that belief was. And we're able to go back through a memory, and we're able to go back in that memory as our mature self, and we have a witness, an authoritative witness of something that helps really show us, whether it's our wiser self or God or grandma or whatever, that can really set us straight in that moment. And when we see the truth, when we go back and see the truth, it changes everything. And that, in a nutshell, are some of the three things. And we'll be explaining more of this in the next lessons to come. But let's look at emotional learning, because if we're going to talk about emotional relearning, we need to learn about emotional learning. How do we learn emotionally? Well, there's 5 parts to emotional learning. The first is the emotional experience. And it's emotional. Then out of that we have an emotional feeling. And then that emotional feeling causes us to believe something. There's an emotional belief tied with it. And that emotional belief then creates an emotional fear. And that fear, emotional fear, causes then an emotional alarm. Let me unpack that, okay, and we'll go through that. First, there's an emotional experience. Something happens, when you're a child or something, and you get yelled at for something you did, or father comes home and he's, yelling at you in a drunken stupor, and you're all of a sudden having an emotional experience. Or maybe it's a birthday and they forgot about it, or you were abandoned. There's a lot of scenarios. Traumas with a small t, right, can even affect this kind of thing. And so, the experience was maybe you were humiliated. And I encourage you, get the notes. I have a whole list here that you can look through. And you can get the notes by contacting me, Ron, at empowerministry.org. And I'll be happy to send them to you. But in that list, there's a bunch of things. But, it could have been humiliation. It could have been that you were ignored. Maybe you were left out. Maybe you were unappreciated. Perhaps you were shamed. And something like that causes then, that kind of experience then can cause an emotional feeling, a reaction, right? And so, there's all kinds of feelings that can come when we have an experience. That happens when there's good things. You have a great birthday, you feel deeply appreciated, right? And so what's the reaction? Joy, right? Exhilaration. But then there's a lot of negative things that cause it, and those negative things, because of our negativity bias, stick with us more than the good things. And it causes us to spiral downhill. And so when you have that experience, for example, that humiliation, well then, it may cause fear, or it could be alarm or anxiousness, right? There's a lot of, being resentful, but it causes some kind of feeling in us. But it doesn't stop there. The third thing is that then we start to we answer the question why, right? And as children especially, we don't have the power, the ability to blame others. It's always more introspective. What did I do? What's wrong with me? How am I going to protect myself from this in the future? Now, we don't quite think it that way, but that's how we react. And so it doesn't stop there. You get an emotional reaction, and then it causes a belief. And when those things happen, you get an emotional belief. And so what are some of them? Well, I don't deserve love, or I'm worthless, I'm not lovable, I'm insignificant, I never do anything right. And so we get these kind of beliefs that start in motion then the way that we look at life. It sets in motion the amygdala to look for triggers. If there was associated with that certain look on the face, maybe the tone of voice, maybe the body posture, then the amygdala remembers that. And when it sees it again, even though it's an implicit out of our awareness memory, we'll get triggered all of a sudden, and we're going right into this feeling, which is backed up by this belief. Now, we're not necessarily in touch with the belief, we're acting out, you see. And that's not enough, though. It isn't good enough that we just have this belief. That belief causes in us then a fear. It causes in us a fear. And it's that fear that really the amygdala is looking at, if you will. For example, in sports, I remember, playing baseball all the time, right? I'd practice for hours, bouncing a ball off the wall, catching it, playing different scenarios. And, I could have games with the friends around the neighborhood and be fine. But when I had a league game and I knew my parents were there or relatives or something, all of a sudden, the fear came in me. That belief that, what if I fail? What if I strike out? And all those beliefs, I'm worthless, I'm insignificant, I can't do anything right. Well, then what it causes in me? Well, I'll be rejected. I'll be left alone. I'll be unlovable. These exaggerated, unrealistic fears start coming up. And so it affects then me playing baseball in front of the others. I remember not going out for sports because of that fear that I had. I'll be rejected, right? And you'd think that would be enough, but it isn't. Yes, that fear is real, but what the amygdala really is reacting to, and it may sound absurd and it doesn't make logical sense, but that's the whole point. These are children, right? We're children thinking of it. And that is, take a child, right? You ever see a child when they get a little cut? I have grandchildren, other children. Oh man, they're afraid to death because there's a drop of blood on their finger and they act like they're going to bleed out, right? And you have to calm them down. Okay, yeah, you're okay. And you put a Band-Aid on it and they calm down. And you understand that and you don't say much because why? They're a child, right? That's a child's reaction. But that's what kind of sticks to us, because not only is it the emotional experience which creates a feeling, which creates a belief, which creates a fear, it sets off an alarm. And what is alarming? It's the consequences of being humiliated. It's the consequences of being left alone. It's the consequences of being unlovable. And what are those? What are those? Well, it's things like, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to be a non-being. I'll be condemned to death. You see, there's only so many things that are catastrophic like that. And that's why I teach a lot of times in the program, and you've heard it in the lessons earlier, I'm not going to die if someone doesn't like me. I'm not going to die if I make an innocent mistake. I'm not going to die if I'm having a panic attack. We cut right to the chase. We got to cut that alarm off. That alarm is saying that little boy thinks he's going to die, right? He's going to bleed out. He's not going to die. And after a couple experiences, the child will learn that, right? And they'll realize not to be so worried about it. But that's what's happening inside of us. And is it rational? Of course not. But it's emotional and it feels real, and you'll be surprised how many of these things guide our lives. And that's the whole nature. And if we're going to be emotionally resilient, then we need to start living with the truth. And the truth is, a lot of these things are exaggerated lies, and we're not going to die. So in order, to really start to emotionally relearn, then we do what we say here. We learn to recognize when we're starting to get out of shape. Then we regulate it. And then we start to relearn emotionally. Well, there's a process to it, and we'll go more into it as we go through the lessons. But we want to become aware, right? We want to become aware when something's bothering us, and we feel it. And we don't run from it, and we stop and we think, okay, what's going on here? I get relaxed. I give the time to God, perhaps, and then I think of the time that I was upset, and I go back to it there, and I say, okay, what was I thinking? What was I feeling? And then I let that take me to another place, another time, right? Because there's like a fingerprint on these emotional scenarios that keep going forward, right? The brain is reacting to a certain signature, if you will. There's a common thread. And so we're able to go back. And we do this all the time. Have you ever walked down the street and it's a hot summer day and they have the window open, you can smell that apple pie, and it takes you right back to grandma's house, right? Or you're going down the road and a certain song comes on and all of a sudden you're back at the junior high dance, right? And so we can do that. We have that ability, and you'll be amazed. And so we're able to go back to a circumstance where we felt that way before, and it's in that circumstance that we're able then to say, okay, what am I believing there? I go back as a visitor to my own memory, and I can see myself there, and I can ask myself, what was I believing? And then I can know what I was believing, and then I can have witnesses, if you will, that will correct it. It could be my own wiser self. It could be God. But, for me, I'll give you an example, was a fear of abandonment. It was huge in my life. And it caused me to react a certain way. I had to be a people pleaser. I had to make sure I did right, because I don't want people to reject me, because if they reject me, I'll be abandoned. If I'm abandoned, I'll die, right? And I remember talking to God about that once. And I was a lot older, and I was in a situation at work where all of a sudden I was being challenged. I felt maybe I'm going to lose my job or something. And I sat there, and I got in touch with that, and I felt it. And I let it take me back to a memory. And I went back to when my mom and dad came home one day, and I'm in the living room, and my brother and I, and mom comes in and says, say bye to your dad, you're never going to see him again. Well, they had been arguing at nights, I'd cry myself to sleep, and they came in, and I remember, it was like I lifted right off the floor, right? It was such a panic in me. And so I went back to that memory, and I invited Jesus to come in. Jesus, please. And so now, this is not a caricature of Jesus. This is not what I'm saying Jesus is like or whatever. But for me, in my imagination, I saw Jesus come, and he sat on the couch, and he kind of had his arm up on the top of the couch like this, kind of relaxed. Really relaxed. And here I am having this horrible experience, right? And so I knew what I was believing, and so I turned to Jesus in my memory. And this is going on real fast while I'm thinking, because I'm asking God to heal me here. And I asked the Jesus that was in my memory, in my visualization, are you going to leave me? And it didn't even break a sweat, didn't even hardly move. He just looked at me and said, I ain't going nowhere. Now, I don't know that Jesus ever used the word ain't. Okay, that's not the point. That's how I talked at the time. And to hear it in my own vernacular, if you will, in such a composed, relaxing, and yet authoritative way. It was God Almighty telling me that He ain't going nowhere. It changed my life. It took that primal fear of abandonment away. Now, I still had little splinters left. You know, when you pull out a big thing, it leaves some residual. And I've worked on that for, over the years. But I'll never forget that experience. And I've helped many, many people with that as well in their own life. And when we can have that kind of emotional relearning, and we've done it in counseling practice with an empty chair. You have someone that died, and you have this thing and that you never were able to tell, or you weren't able, and so you have them talk to the empty chair. And then they get in the empty chair and answer it because they know what the answer is. We know the truth. We just don't know it here. And that empty chair kind of technique is similar to this. And so we know that we can learn the truth emotionally when we take an authoritative power and listen to it. And I find that we deeply know the truth. We just need to know it from a source that counts. And we'll get more into this in the lessons to come. I know for some of you this may be way out there, but I invite you, listen to this part again. Back up the video, listen to it again, see what I'm trying to say here, read the notes, and prepare yourself for the next couple weeks to embrace what I'm talking about. Next time we're going to talk about how do we learn and how do we relearn. We're going to go over the learning process a little more where we can deeply understand this, and then we'll get back into what is emotional relearning, where we can do these kind of things for ourselves, where we can know the truth, and the truth will set us free.